Welcome back to Elle Loves Miracles. Today we're diving into the story that'll grip your heart, the incredible true tale of Jayme Closs. How did a 13-year-old find the strength to escape a predator's clutches and bring herself home? Join me as we uncover Jayme's journey from a night of terror to a moment of pure bravery. Her parents were taken from her and she was kidnapped by a stranger who held her captive for 88 days. This isn't just a story of tragedy, it's a testament to courage, resilience, and the kind of miracle that shines through the darkest moments. Warning, this episode contains discussions and references to violence, including but not limited to depictions of physical harm, conflict, and sensitive topics. This discussion is intended for informational, educational, and storytelling purposes, and are not meant to glorify, endorse, or promote violence in any form. Viewer and listener discretion is advised, as this content may be disturbing and triggering to some audiences. Jayme Lynn Closs was born on July 13, 2005 in Barron, Wisconsin. It was a small town of about 3,300 people in northwestern Wisconsin. Barron's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, with a tight-knit working-class vibe. Think community events, local diners, and a lot of pride in their schools. Sounds like a wholesome place, doesn't it? Jayme was the only child of James and Denise Closs, who were both lifelong Barron residents. Both her parents worked at Genio Turkey Store Plant. It was a major employer in their town. They were described as hardworking, kind, and devoted to their child, with a strong sense of family and faith. By all accounts, Jayme's childhood was happy and stable. Her parents were super close to her, especially her mom, Denise. Family members told outlets like People magazine that Jayme and Denise were like best friends. They'd do typical family stuff like movie nights, cooking, and just hanging out at home. James, her dad, was more reserved but protective. Jayme grew up in a modest single-story house on Highway 8, surrounded by woods and a quiet neighborhood. Jayme attended schools in the local area. She was described as quiet, sweet, and a bit shy, but not in a withdrawn way. She had friends and was well-liked. Classmates and teachers told the news outlets that she was the type to smile easily and get along with everyone. She wasn't a troublemaker or super outgoing, but a typical middle schooler finding her place. She was involved in activities that showed her creative side. Jayme loved dancing, especially tap and jazz, and she was part of a local dance team. Her Aunt Jennifer later shared that dance was a way for Jayme to express herself, and she'd light up performing. She also enjoyed sports like volleyball and cross country, though she wasn't a star athlete. Her childhood was filled with those small town moments, school events, sleepovers, and community gatherings, like the Barron Harvest Festival. She wasn't glued to social media or chasing popularity. She just lived a grounded, normal life. Jayme had a soft spot for animals, especially her dog Molly. Family members described her as nurturing, the kind of kid who would pet every dog she saw. She also loved nature, likely a product of growing up in rural Wisconsin, where hiking, biking, and just being outside was part of the deal. She had a goofy side that came out with close friends and family, just a kid who found joy in the little things. Her family attended a local church and faith was part of her life. Jayme grew up with Christian values, which likely gave her a sense of community and grounding. Jayme was still in the phase of her childhood where she was figuring things out, surrounded by people who had her back. October 15th, 2018. Jayme was 13 years old. Jayme, her dad James, and her mom Denise were at home, likely winding down for the night. It was a typical Sunday in Barron. Jayme was asleep in her bedroom and was awoken by her dog Molly barking around 12:30 a.m. She looked outside and saw a car in the driveway. It was a red or an orange Ford Taurus with its headlights off. The car was unfamiliar and something felt wrong. Jayme, showing quick thinking for a 13-year-old, ran to her parents' room to wake them. James, her dad, grabbed a flashlight and went to check the front door, while Denise and Jayme stayed inside. At 12:53 a.m., James approached the front door, where a man was already on the porch, holding his shotgun. The door had a small window, and James, thinking it might be a police officer due to the late hour and strange car, yelled, "Show me your badge." Instead of responding, the man fired a single shotgun blast through the window, hitting James in the head and killing him instantly. The shot was loud, echoing through the quiet neighborhood, but no neighbors reported hearing it. James fell in the doorway, and the man stepped over his body to enter the house. Denise and Jayme, hearing the gunshot, panicked and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind them. They barricaded themselves in the bathtub, with Denise pulling a cabinet drawer to block the door for extra protection. Denise grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911 at 12:53 a.m. The call connected to the Barron County Sheriff's Department, but it was chaotic. Dispatchers heard yelling and commotion but couldn't make out clear words. The call lasted less than a minute before it disconnected. The intruder broke through the locked door, likely with the force of his steel-toed boots or the butt of his gun. When he got in, he found Denise and Jayme cowering in the bathtub. He handed Denise duct tape and ordered her to tape Jayme's mouth shut. Some report states that Denise complied, and others state she didn't. Then, in a horrifying moment, the intruder raised his shotgun and shot Denise in the head, killing her right in front of Jayme. Around 12:57 a.m., with both her parents gone, the intruder moved fast. He used more duct tape to bind Jayme's hands and ankles, ensuring she couldn't fight back. He dragged her out of the bathroom and down the hall and past her father's body in the doorway and out to his car in the driveway. He stuffed her into the trunk of his Ford Taurus, slamming it shut. The entire crime, from the first shot to driving away, took about 4 minutes. As the intruder drove off, the Barron County Sheriff's deputies responding to the 911 call were speeding towards the Closs home, just minutes behind. The neighbor's doorbell camera captured police cars arriving at 12:58 a.m., but the intruder was already gone with Jayme, heading north on Highway 8 towards Gordon, about 70 miles away. Jayme, bound and terrified in the trunk, could hear sirens but had no way to call for help. The deputies arrived at the home around 1 a.m., finding a nightmare. James was dead in the doorway, Denise was dead in the bathroom, and Jayme was gone. The front door was kicked in, the bathroom door damaged, and the house was eerily quiet except for Molly the dog, who had survived. The 911 call log, later released, showed dispatchers heard a lot of yelling but no clear conversation, and the call's abrupt end raised immediate alarm. Police found no sign of Jayme, no blood, no clues about where she had gone. They issued an Amber Alert at 2 a.m., describing her as 5 foot tall, 100 pounds with green eyes and blonde hair, and considered her endangered. The kidnapper drove Jayme to his family's cabin in Gordon. It was a remote area with few neighbors. The drive took roughly an hour on rural Wisconsin roads. Jayme was terrified. She was in the trunk, likely in shock after witnessing her parents' murders. The kidnapper, paranoid and calculated, had stolen license plates in a used car with no headlights to avoid detection, so he slipped through without being stopped. The rural nature of the route, Highway 8 to Highway 53, then smaller roads into Gordon, meant few witnesses or traffic cams. He reached his family's cabin in Gordon, a remote town of under 700 people, around 2 a.m. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by woods and sparse neighbors, perfect for hiding someone. It was a single-story, modest place owned by his father, where he had lived alone after his sister moved out. The isolation was key. Gordon was the kind of place where you could go unnoticed for weeks. Once there, he forced her to strip off her clothes, which he burned in the basement fireplace along with the duct tape and his gloves to destroy evidence. He gave her his sister's old pajamas to wear and began the ordeal of keeping her hidden, mostly under his twin bed. This moment set the tone for her captivity, total control, and he erased her identity. Barron, Wisconsin, being a small town where everyone knows everyone, violent crime is rare. When the news broke on October 15th of 2018 that James and Denise were found dead in their home and their 13-year-old daughter was missing, the town was rocked. By morning, volunteers searched the woods, fields, and rural areas around Barron. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers felt a personal stake in finding her. As one resident told CBS News, "This isn't supposed to happen here. We're a family, and Jayme's one of ours." The Closs home on Highway 8 was on the edge of town, surrounded by forests and farmland, so volunteers scoured nearby ditches, trails, and abandoned buildings, hoping for any sign of Jayme. The Barron County Sheriff's Department coordinated these efforts, but with no leads on a suspect or a vehicle, the search was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The community in Barron, unaware of where she was, launched a massive search with over 1,000 tips flooding in. The Jenny O Turkey Store, where James and Denise worked for years, stepped up big. By October 16th, they offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to Jayme's return, which the FBI matched, bringing the total to $50,000. Jenny O also gave the employees time off to join the search efforts and provide resources like food and water for volunteers. Prayer vigils started at local churches. A tree of hope was set up at Riverview Middle School, decorated with ribbons and messages for Jayme, becoming a focal point for the community. Kids from her school left notes like "Come home, Jayme," showing how her classmates were reeling. The Barron County Sheriff's Department was stretched thin, so the Wisconsin Department of Justice and the FBI got involved. Over 100 officers from multiple agencies worked the case, chasing down tips and canvassing neighborhoods. They used drones, infrared cameras, and canine units to search rural areas. The police officers went door to door in Barron asking about suspicious vehicles or people around October 15th. They set up road checkpoints, stopping cars to ask drivers if they had seen anything that night. Jayme's face went everywhere: flyers, billboards, and news broadcasts. The Amber Alert went national, and outlets like ABC News and People magazine covered the story relentlessly. Social media, especially Facebook groups like Find Jayme Closs, exploded with thousands of posts sharing her photo and details. The hashtag #FindJayme trended locally, and strangers from across the U.S. sent messages of support. 4 days after the kidnapping, Barron held a massive community event called A Gathering for Jayme at a local park. Hundreds showed up wearing green ribbons, Jayme's favorite color, and releasing balloons to symbolize hope. Jayme's school brought in counselors for students. Throughout October and November, churches and schools held weekly prayer services and candlelit vigils. Jayme's dance team organized a fundraiser, selling bracelets to support the reward fund. I think it's safe to say that they exhausted resources looking for her. The search wasn't easy. The lack of leads frustrated everyone. Early on, the police thought it might be someone close to the family since most kidnappings involve a known person. Tips range from sightings in Wisconsin to wild claims that Jayme had been spotted in Florida or even Mexico. Police chased every lead, but nothing panned out. The community felt helpless. Volunteers searched the same area repeatedly, and rumors swirled on social media, some blaming the Closs family or spreading conspiracies. Jayme's Aunt Jennifer begged the media to focus on facts, not gossip. Meanwhile, the kidnapper told Jayme she would be hurt or killed if she tried to escape or make noise, leveraging the trauma of her parents' murders to keep her compliant. The cabin's layout was simple. It was a living room area, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a basement. He focused on settling in and ensuring no one suspected anything. His main tactic was hiding Jayme under his twin bed, which was about 2.5 feet off the ground. He'd barricade her in with plastic storage bins, laundry baskets, and weights, making it impossible for her to crawl out without moving heavy objects. This started soon after her arrival, though it's unclear if he did it the first night or after a day or two. He forced her to stay there for hours, especially when he left the house or had visitors. She was kept under the bed for up to 12 hours at a time, often without food, water, or bathroom access, which was both physically and mentally grueling. Occasionally, he would reinforce his threats by hitting her. After murdering her parents, it was enough to keep her terrified. He also bragged to her about how he had avoided capture, saying the police had no leads, which was meant to crush her hope. Her kidnapper didn't have a job or a busy social life, which let him focus on keeping Jayme hidden. She stayed in his sister's pajamas, and there's no records of him giving her other clothes or personal items. He kept up normal exterior to avoid suspicion. He'd leave the cabin to drive around or run errands. And occasionally he had visitors who would come by unaware that Jayme was there. By January 10th of 2019, Jayme Closs had been captive for nearly 3 months. Despite the trauma, Jayme was observant. She memorized details about her captivity and the man who kidnapped her, his name, his car, and the cabin's layout, which later proved crucial. Jayme's resilience was building. That morning, the kidnapper told Jayme he was leaving the cabin for a few hours. That wasn't unusual. He'd leave her alone sometimes, always ensuring she was trapped under the bed with the bins and the weights. But this time, Jayme saw her chance. Around mid-afternoon, Jayme was alone in the cabin and under the bed. The cabin was quiet, with no visitors expected. Jayme, who'd been through 88 days of hell, witnessing her parents' murders, being bound and stuffed in a trunk, and living under constant threat, decided this was it. She didn't have a plan beyond getting out, but her courage kicked in. It was her gut instinct speaking to her. Jayme pushed against the barricade of bins, baskets, and weights. This wasn't easy. The weights were heavy, and they were meant to keep her immobile, and the bins were packed tightly to block her escape. She had to wiggle and shove inch by inch in the dark, cramped space, knowing any noise could be risky if he came home. Eventually, with determination, she got through. She crawled out from under the bed, and she was free for a moment inside the cabin. Jayme didn't hesitate. She was wearing the oversized pajamas and no shoes. She grabbed a pair of his sneakers, putting them on the wrong feet. It was January in Wisconsin, very cold, snowy, with temperatures likely in the 20s or 30s. She didn't have a coat or gloves, just the pajamas and mismatched sneakers. She bolted out the front door into the winter air and started running into the unknown, driven by the need to get away. Jayme didn't know where she was. It was isolated, rural, and the roads were covered in snow with scattered homes. She ran a few hundred yards and spotted a woman walking her dog on the road. Her name was Jean Nutter. Jean was a social worker who had moved to Gordon for retirement. She was out for a routine walk with her dog. Jayme was thin, disheveled, and clearly out of place in pajamas and oversized shoes. She approached her and said, "I'm Jayme Closs. He killed my parents and I want to go home. Help me." Jean immediately recognized Jayme's name from news reports. Jean, shocked but quick thinking, grabbed Jayme and rushed her to the nearest house. It was owned by Kristen and Peter Kaczynskis. It was around 4 p.m. and the sun was starting to set. Jayme was shaking, she was cold, and she was terrified, but coherent enough to share key details. She shared Patterson's name, his red or orange Ford Taurus, and that she had been held captive in his cabin. Kristen and Peter welcomed Jayme and Jean inside, locking the door and calling 911 at 4:18 p.m. Kristen later told news outlets that Jayme looked like a ghost. She was pale, skinny, and fragile after 88 days of captivity, but she was calm and clear-headed. She didn't eat or drink much, possibly too overwhelmed, but she answered questions about her captor. The 911 call, later summarized by police, was urgent. "We have Jayme Closs. She's here. She says Jake Patterson took her." The Douglas County Sheriff's Department dispatched deputies immediately. While they were waiting for the police, Jayme stayed inside Kristen and Peter's home. She was safe but on edge. Jayme's details about Patterson were precise. She described his car, his house, and his routine, which showed how closely she had been paying attention despite her fear. This was crucial as it gave police a clear target. Who is Jake Patterson, you might ask? Jake Thomas Patterson was born in 1997. He grew up in Gordon, Wisconsin, the small town where he held Jayme captive. Jake came from a working-class family. His parents, Patrick and Deborah Patterson, divorced when he was young, but they both stayed involved in his life. He lived primarily with his father in the family's cabin, which later became the site of Jayme's captivity, and his mother lived nearby. There's no public record of major family drama or abuse. His family was described as ordinary, and neighbors didn't recall anything glaringly dysfunctional. Jake attended Northwood School, a K-12 school with a small student body. Classmates described him as quiet, shy, and kind of a loner. He wasn't bullied or a troublemaker. He just kept to himself. He played sports like football and track, but wasn't a star or a super jock. He wasn't extremely social. One classmate told the New York Times that he was smart but didn't apply himself. He graduated high school in 2015, and his senior yearbook quote was something generic about living life to the fullest. Ironic, given what followed. Overall, his childhood and teen years were unremarkable, with no red flags like juvenile delinquency and mental health issues noted. After graduation, his life started to drift. In 2015, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, but he washed out of boot camp at Parris Island just after 5 weeks. The Marines discharged him for failing to meet standards. Those specifics aren't public. This was a blow to whatever plans he had, and it left him back in Gordon with no clear path. After that, Jake bounced around doing temp jobs. He worked briefly at a cheese factory, where he saw Jayme getting on the school bus one morning in 2018. He quit that job after a day or two, citing no real reasons. He also worked at a turkey processing plant. Coincidentally, it was the same Jennie-O plant where Jayme's parents worked. He didn't stay there very long. His work history was very spotty, and he wasn't known for holding steady employment. In 2018, at the age of 21, Patterson was living alone in his family's cabin. His sister had already moved out, and his dad wasn't around much. He had no close friends and no girlfriend. Neighbors in Gordon told the news outlets that he was polite but distant. He didn't party, he didn't do drugs, and he had no criminal record. Nothing to make him stand out as a threat. His social media presence was minimal, and he didn't leave a digital trail of weird manifestos or red flags. Patterson, unaware of Jayme's escape, returned to the cabin around 4:30 p.m., and he realized she was gone. He jumped back into his Ford Taurus and started driving around Gordon, looking for her. Meanwhile, deputies were closing in, armed with Jayme's description of his car. Around 4:43 p.m., they spotted the Taurus on a rural road near the cabin and pulled him over. Patterson surrendered without a fight, reportedly saying, "I did it." He later told police that he had been driving around looking for Jayme, knowing that his plan had unraveled. The cabin was searched that evening, confirming Jayme's story. The twin bed, the bins, the weights, and the burned clothes in the fireplace. Jake was taken to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office in Superior, Wisconsin, for questioning before being transferred to Barron County. The interrogation, detailed in a transcript released by the Wisconsin Department of Justice on December 20th of 2019, provides the bulk of what he confessed, corroborated by the criminal complaint and Jayme's own account. He told the police he didn't know her name until after the kidnapping when he saw it on the news reports. His decision to take her was impulsive, yet followed by weeks of planning, including 2 aborted attempts to kidnap her. This obsession drove his actions. Jake's statements paint a picture of an impulsive yet calculated act driven by a fixation on Jayme, with chilling details about the planning, execution, and aftermath of the kidnapping and murders. He spoke in a monosyllabic, unemotional tone, as noted by officers, showing little remorse beyond fleeting guilt. Jake told investigators he first saw Jayme in early October 2018 while driving to a temporary job at the cheese factory. He was stopped behind a school bus on Highway 8 near the Closs home in Barron when he saw Jayme get on. He said he knew that was the girl he was going to take. He didn't know her name or anything about her family, but became obsessed with kidnapping her after that single sighting. Wow, this guy's on a whole nother level. Jake admitted he didn't research the Closs family. He told police he didn't know if they had guns, how many people lived in the house. His fixation was purely impulsive, driven by a fantasy he'd harbored since his brief stint in the Marines. About a week prior, he drove to the Closs home, but was scared off by multiple cars in the driveway. A second attempt was aborted because he saw lights and people inside, making him fear witnesses. On his third attempt, he went through with it. Jake said he planned the abduction carefully to avoid detection. He shaved his head and face to avoid leaving hair behind, wore gloves to prevent fingerprints, and he wiped down shotgun shells to remove DNA. He chose his father's 12-gauge shotgun because it was a common model, harder to trace, and a slug would inflict the most damage. He stole license plates from a parked vehicle and put it on the back of his red Ford Taurus, and leaving the front plateless. He also disabled the car's dome light, trunk light, and the glow-in-the-dark trunk release cord to ensure Jayme couldn't escape or signal for help. To pump himself up, on October 15th, Jake said he put the shotgun in his mouth at home, contemplating self-harm, telling himself, either I'm going to die or they are. He drove from Gordon to Barron, which was about 70 miles, with a stolen plate and his lights off to avoid detection. Jake told police he parked at the end of the Closs driveway just before 12:53 a.m. He was dressed in black with a ski mask and gloves, carrying the shotgun. He saw 56-year-old Jayme Closs shine a flashlight through a glass pane in the front door and demand to see a badge. Assuming Jake was law enforcement, Jake shouted, "Open the door." And when Jayme didn't comply, he shot him in the head through the glass, then fired at the doorknob to break in, stepping over James's body. Once inside, Jake found a locked bathroom door. He shouldered it open after a dozen tries. He ripped down the shower curtain to find Denise, 46, and Jayme hiding in the bathtub, with Denise holding Jayme in a bear hug. Denise had called 911 from her cell phone, but Patterson grabbed it and threw it aside. He handed Denise the duct tape, ordering her to tape Jayme's mouth. But when she struggled, he taped Jayme's mouth, wrists, and ankles himself. He then pointed the shotgun at Denise's head, looked away, and shot her, killing her instantly. He dragged Jayme outside and put her in the trunk of his car, driving off within 5 minutes of entering the house. Jake said he pulled over about 20 seconds down the road from the Closs home as 3 squad cars sped by with sirens and lights, responding to Denise's 911 call. He told the police he would have shot at officers or himself if he was stopped, and he only had 3 bullets left and was prepared to die. Jayme confirmed hearing sirens from the trunk of the car. After reaching the family's cabin, Jake ordered Jayme to strip, saying she had wet herself from fear. He admitted he burned her clothes, the duct tape, and his gloves in the basement fireplace to destroy evidence, then gave her his sister's pajamas. He laid her on his bed, but feeling sick about what he had done, he slept on the couch that first night. Jake told police he controlled Jayme through fear, saying, "I know that she was just terrified of me." He never installed extra locks on doors or windows, trusting her fear to keep her in line. He admitted to hitting her once with a household object when she upset him, warning the worst would follow if she disobeyed him. Jake gave Jayme food and water, but she initially refused to eat. He allowed her to walk in the yard with him occasionally, but never off the property. He tried to cut her hair once to change her appearance, but she cried and refused, so he didn't. He followed news about the case on his phone and changed the TV channel if anything about Jayme came up, telling her, "I'm sorry, I can't watch this." Once, while drunk and feeling guilty, he let Jayme write a letter to her aunt to let her family know she was alive. He planned to drop it off but never did, and the letter was still in the cabin when he was arrested. Jake told police he thought he'd gotten away with the murders and the kidnapping after 2 weeks without being caught. He grew more confident over time, following news reports and believing the police had no leads. His lack of a criminal record and minimal connection to Barron helped him stay off the radar. He admitted acting impulsive, with no clear plan for what to do with Jayme long term. He vaguely thought he'd get a job and rent an apartment, saying, "I'm really good at just not thinking about stuff." Jake said that January 10th of 2019 was the only day that Jayme ever tried to escape, catching him off guard. When Jake returned around 4:30 p.m., he found Jayme gone and saw her footprints in the snow. He told the police, "I knew I was caught," when he saw police and realized she had escaped. Jake offered little insight into why he targeted Jayme beyond saying he'd fantasized about abducting a young girl, but he didn't elaborate on what drove that obsession. No sexual assault charges were filed, and the complaint doesn't mention specific allegations of that nature. He expressed fleeting guilt, saying he felt so bad when looking at Jayme, unable to believe he'd committed the crimes. His efforts to avoid detection by shaving his head, wiping his shells, and stealing the plates show a premeditated intent to get away with murder and kidnapping. Yet his lack of a long-term plan and vague motive suggest a disturbed, aimless individual acting on a dark fantasy. His claim that Jayme was terrified and wouldn't escape reflects his reliance on psychological control, underestimating her resilience. The interrogation transcript highlights his flat affect and narcissism, as noted by criminologists, who found his lack of remorse and impulsive yet ritualistic behavior unusual for such a violent offender. Some details are redacted in the release transcripts to protect Jayme's privacy, especially regarding her captivity conditions. Patterson's vague motives, stemming from a random sighting and a long-held fantasy, leaves questions about what drove him psychologically. Jayme was taken to a hospital in Duluth, Minnesota, about 40 miles from Gordon, for a medical check. She was malnutritioned and shaken, but no life-threatening injuries. That night, she was reunited with her aunt, Jennifer Smith, and her dog, Molly, who'd survived the kidnapping that night. The town of Barron, 70 miles away, erupted in celebration. Church bells rang and people gathered at the Tree of Hope at Riverview Middle School, where the community had held vigils for 88 days. Sheriff Chris Fitzgerald called Jayme the hero of the case. The $50,000 reward was given to Jayme since she saved herself. Jake Patterson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of armed burglary. The last was later dropped. In March of 2019, he pleaded guilty, saying he wanted to spare Jayme and her family the pain of a trial. At his sentencing on May 24, 2019, the judge called him the embodiment of evil and handed down 2 consecutive life sentences without parole for the murders, plus 40 years for the kidnapping. Patterson showed some emotion, saying he was sorry, but also shouting, "Bye, Jayme," at a courtroom camera. He was later registered as a sex offender and transferred to a prison in New Mexico for safety reasons after getting into a fight with another inmate. Jayme didn't attend the sentencing, but her statement, read by her attorney, was gut-wrenching. "He stole my parents from me. He stole almost everything I loved. For 88 days he tried to steal me. But he didn't care who he hurt or killed to do that. He should stay locked up forever." She talked about how she loved her parents, her home, her room, and how Patterson's actions made it hard to see her old home without reliving the trauma. After her escape, Jayme went to live with her Aunt Jennifer Smith and uncle in Barron. The Closs home was eventually torn down. Too painful a reminder. By 2021, her aunt shared that Jayme, then 16, was doing good, getting back into dance, school activities, and trying to reclaim her life. Jayme became an advocate for missing and exploited children, and her story has raised awareness about child abduction. In 2019, she received a Hometown Hero Award from the Wisconsin Assembly. By 2024, 5 years after her escape, Jayme was still living with her family and focusing on healing. Her story is a mix of horror and resilience, and she's been compared to survivors like Elizabeth Smart, who've praised her strength. I call this a miracle. It's a miracle she survived, it's a miracle she escaped, and it's a miracle she stayed alive. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.